The entire courtroom fell silent when the judge slammed his gavel and said, "Remove that cross or pay the price." No one expected what would happen next. It was a packed courtroom. Reporters lined the back wall. Lawyers shuffled papers nervously. At the defense table sat Pam Bondi, calm and composed, wearing a simple black suit. Around her neck hung a small silver cross. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just a quiet symbol of her faith. The case that day was already high profile. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the media frenzy outside made it clear. This trial mattered. Tensions were high. Every word spoken in that courtroom carried weight. Then the judge's eyes locked onto the necklace. He paused mid-sentence. "Miss Bondi," he said sternly, "that religious symbol violates this court's neutrality standards. Remove it immediately." Gasps rippled through the room. Pam Bondi didn't react with anger. She didn't argue. She simply looked up at the judge with steady confidence. "Your Honor," she said respectfully, "with all due respect, I believe you may be mistaken." And that was the moment everything changed. For a brief second, it felt as if time itself had slowed. The scratching of pens stopped. The low hum of whispered conversations faded. Even the air in the room seemed heavier. The judge leaned forward. "This courtroom," he continued firmly, "must remain free of personal religious displays. I will not allow any symbol that could be interpreted as influencing these proceedings." The statement hung in the air. Some spectators exchanged confused glances. Others frowned. Religious jewelry was not uncommon. Attorneys, jurors, and even members of the public often wore small symbols of personal belief. Why was this suddenly an issue? But the judge's tone made it clear. This was not a casual suggestion. Pam Bondi folded her hands calmly on the table before her. Her expression remained steady, neither defensive nor confrontational. She understood something important in that moment. This was bigger than a necklace. "Your Honor," she began carefully, "may I clarify something before I respond?" The judge hesitated, clearly surprised by her composed tone. "Proceed." She stood slowly, the small cross catching the light for just a moment. Not dramatically, but enough to remind everyone what had sparked the tension. "This symbol," she said gently, touching the necklace, "is not intended to influence this court, this jury, or these proceedings in any way. It is a personal expression of my faith, something I wear every day." Her voice was calm, measured, and respectful. "I am here today in my professional capacity. My arguments will be based on facts, evidence, and the law. This necklace does not alter that." The courtroom remained silent. The judge responded sharply. "Intent is not the issue. Perception is. We must avoid even the appearance of religious influence." That word, appearance, seemed to echo. Pam Bondi nodded slightly. "I understand the importance of neutrality, Your Honor, but neutrality requires balance. It ensures the court does not promote religion, but it also ensures the court does not suppress personal expression." A few heads turned. Some attorneys began paying closer attention. She continued, her tone unwavering. "If wearing a small cross quietly around my neck is considered a violation, then where does that line stop? Are we to inspect every ring, every bracelet, every item that might hold personal religious meaning?" The judge shifted slightly in his seat. "This court will not debate hypotheticals," he replied. "You will remove the necklace, or I will impose a fine for contempt." The tension spiked again. For many in that room, this had shifted from a dress code issue to something much larger, a question about individual rights within a public institution. Pam Bondi took a slow breath. There was no anger in her face, no defiance in her posture, only quiet conviction. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "I cannot remove it." The words were soft, but they carried weight. A murmur swept through the gallery. The judge's expression hardened. "Then you leave this court no choice." He raised the gavel once more. $500 for contempt. The sharp crack of wood against wood echoed through the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously. Spectators whispered. The energy in the room shifted from tension to disbelief. Yet through it all, Pam Bondi did not flinch. Instead, she reached calmly into her briefcase and removed a notepad. She wrote something down, perhaps a note, perhaps a legal reference, and then looked back up at the bench. "Your Honor," she said once more, "may I request an opportunity to address the constitutional basis for this order?" It wasn't defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It was strategy. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom sensed it. This situation was far from over. What had begun as a simple command about a necklace was now becoming a defining moment. One that would test not only the authority of the bench, but the principles that governed the courtroom itself. And as all eyes remained fixed on her, one thing became clear. Pam Bondi was not backing down. Not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. And the real battle had only just begun. The judge's expression hardened. "This courtroom is a place of law, not personal displays," he declared. "You may remove it, or you will be fined for contempt." Whispers filled the room. Some people looked shocked. Others looked confused. Attorneys often wore religious jewelry. It wasn't unusual. Why was this different? But the judge was firm. When Pam Bondi calmly declined to remove the necklace, the gavel struck again. $500, he announced, payable immediately. The sharp crack echoed across the wooden walls like a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the silence that followed them. $500 for a necklace. The courtroom buzzed louder now. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, their pens racing across paper. One journalist quietly slipped out the back door, no doubt rushing to be the first to break the story. A fine for wearing a cross? This would be headline news before lunchtime. In the gallery, spectators leaned toward one another, whispering in disbelief. Is that even allowed? Can he do that? This is going to blow up. At the prosecution table, opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably. Even they seemed unsure how to react. What had started as a routine proceeding had suddenly transformed into something far more dramatic and potentially historic. Yet through it all, Pam Bondi remained composed. She didn't slam her hand on the table. She didn't accuse the judge of bias. She didn't turn toward the audience for sympathy. Her posture remained straight. Her hands rested lightly on the table in front of her, her breathing steady, her eyes clear. The calmness was almost unsettling, because in moments like this, most people react. They defend, they argue, they push back emotionally. But she didn't. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She smiled slightly. It wasn't a sarcastic smile. It wasn't defiant. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they recognize an opportunity hidden inside a challenge. And then she slowly rose to her feet. The movement alone quieted the room. "Your Honor," she began, her voice measured and respectful. "May I have permission to address the court?" The judge studied her carefully. He had likely expected resistance, perhaps even anger. Instead, he was met with composure. "You may speak briefly," he replied. She nodded in gratitude. "Thank you, Your Honor." She paused, not for drama, but to choose her words carefully. "I fully respect the authority of this court," she said, "and I understand the importance of maintaining order and neutrality within these walls." The judge gave a short nod, as if to say, "Good, she understands." "But," she continued gently, "neutrality is a principle designed to protect fairness, not to restrict individual expression." A ripple of attention moved through the room. She wasn't arguing emotionally. She was building something, carefully, deliberately. "This necklace," she said, touching the small silver cross resting against her suit, "is not a statement to the jury. It is not a message to the public. It is not a symbol directed at this court. It is something I wear daily, regardless of where I am." Her voice remained steady. "It does not alter my legal arguments. It does not change the evidence presented. It does not interfere with the administration of justice." The judge leaned back slightly, listening now, not interrupting. "If this court determines that any visible religious symbol constitutes a violation," she continued, "then that standard must apply equally and consistently. That would include jewelry, clothing, or items worn by anyone present, attorneys, staff, or spectators." A few heads turned instinctively around the room, as if suddenly aware of rings, bracelets, subtle pendants. The courtroom felt different now, less like a confrontation, more like a constitutional conversation. "I would respectfully ask," she said, "on what specific legal basis does this court determine that my personal religious symbol disrupts neutrality?" There it was, the question. Not an accusation, not an attack. A question. The judge's jaw tightened slightly. This was no longer a simple directive about courtroom decorum. Now it required justification. "The court has broad discretion to maintain order," he replied. "Absolutely," she agreed quickly. And I support that authority. My question is simply whether wearing a small religious symbol, without commentary or disruption, meets the threshold of disorder or influence. Silence. The spectators were no longer whispering. They were listening. Even the reporters had paused their frantic writing. Because what everyone realized in that moment was this: she wasn't refusing the fine out of stubbornness. She was challenging the reasoning behind it. And she was doing it without raising her voice. Your Honor, she concluded calmly, I am prepared to comply with any lawful order of this court. But I believe this matter deserves clarification before a penalty is enforced. She sat down slowly. No dramatic gestures, no triumphant expression. Just quiet confidence. The judge glanced down at his notes, then back up at her. The authority in his posture had shifted, not vanished, but softened by the weight of her reasoning. The courtroom waited. What had begun as a simple fine now felt like a turning point, and everyone could sense it. This wasn't about $500 anymore. It was about principle. And the next words from the bench would determine far more than the fate of a necklace. Your Honor, she began, her tone steady and respectful. May I ask a clarifying question? The judge hesitated. The courtroom felt suspended in anticipation. Finally, he gave a short nod. Proceed. Pam Bondi rose fully to her feet, her posture straight, her expression calm. There was no anger in her eyes, only focus. Is this courtroom a public institution governed by constitutional law? Of course it is, the judge replied, his voice firm but slightly guarded. She nodded thoughtfully. And does that same constitution protect individuals from government restrictions on personal religious expression? She continued. The room grew very still. It was the kind of silence that makes every small sound noticeable. The hum of the lights above, the faint shuffle of someone adjusting in their seat, the soft click of a pen being set down. The judge shifted slightly in his seat. The Constitution protects religious freedom, he answered carefully. But this court must remain neutral. Pam Bondi didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge his words directly. Instead, she built on them. Absolutely, Your Honor, she said. Neutrality is essential. But neutrality means the government does not favor one religion over another, or religion over non-religion. It does not mean erasing personal expression from individuals who serve within public institutions. Her voice was calm, but every word was deliberate. This cross, she said gently, touching the necklace resting against her collarbone, is not a disruption. It is not a political statement. It is not an attempt to persuade this jury or influence this court. It is a personal expression of faith. She paused, letting that distinction settle. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution protects citizens, including officers of the court, from being penalized for peaceful religious expression. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. A few nodded subtly. One reporter underlined something 3 times in his notebook. The judge's fingers tapped lightly against the bench. Pam Bondi continued, her voice unwavering. If the court prohibits visible religious symbols worn by individuals, then that standard must apply equally to all. Are we also prohibiting wedding rings with religious inscriptions, religious head coverings, medals bearing spiritual significance? Her questions weren't rhetorical attacks. They were logical extensions. Would a bailiff be asked to remove a small cross? Would a member of the public be instructed to leave for wearing a Star of David? Would an attorney be fined for wearing a headscarf worn for religious reasons? The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, not with hostility, but with realization. Because her argument wasn't emotional. It was consistent. If neutrality requires the removal of all visible faith symbols, she continued, then the policy must be universal, clearly defined, and applied equally. Otherwise, we risk selectively restricting expression. The judge leaned back slightly, absorbing her words. And selective restriction, she added gently, is precisely what constitutional protections are designed to prevent. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tension. Before, the silence had been shock. Now it was contemplation. Even opposing counsel seemed reluctant to interrupt. Pam Bondi took a slow breath before continuing. I stand before this court as an attorney, she said. My arguments will rise or fall on the law and the evidence presented, not on the necklace I wear. If my conduct were disruptive, I would understand correction. But a silent symbol worn daily does not interfere with justice. Her voice softened slightly, but her conviction did not. Respectfully, Your Honor, the Constitution does not require citizens to shed their identities when they enter public service. It It requires the government to refrain from compelling or restricting belief. The judge's earlier certainty was fading. His expression had shifted from firm authority to measured consideration. Because this wasn't defiance. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused him of wrongdoing. She hadn't appealed to emotion or public sympathy. She had appealed to principle. And principles, once spoken clearly, are difficult to dismiss. A quiet murmur moved through the spectators again. Not chaotic this time, but thoughtful. The kind of sound that signals minds changing. The judge cleared his throat. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that enforcing this order could constitute a constitutional violation?" "I'm suggesting," she replied evenly, "that penalizing peaceful personal expression in a public courtroom deserves careful constitutional consideration before punishment is imposed. Careful, measured, respectful, but unmistakably firm." The judge glanced down at his notes, then back up at her. The gavel that had sounded so decisive earlier now rested motionless beneath his hand. For the first time since the confrontation began, he did not immediately respond. And that silence spoke volumes. Because in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood something powerful. This wasn't about challenging authority. It was about understanding the limits of it. Pam Bondi slowly returned to her seat, her composure unchanged. She had not won anything yet. The fine had not been withdrawn. The order had not been reversed. But something had shifted. The confidence in the judge's earlier demand had softened under the weight of constitutional logic. And the courtroom, once buzzing with disbelief, now sat in thoughtful stillness. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't rebellion. It was reason. And reason, delivered with calm conviction, can be more powerful than any raised voice. The next move would belong to the judge. But the balance in the room had already begun to change. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. The judge cleared his throat. "This court must maintain neutrality," he insisted, though his voice now carried a trace of uncertainty. "And neutrality," Pam Bondi replied carefully, "means the government does not promote religion, but it also does not suppress it." That sentence landed heavily. Suppress it. The word seemed to echo off the wooden panels and marble floors. Suddenly, what had begun as a simple dress code dispute no longer felt simple at all. It wasn't about jewelry. It wasn't about courtroom decorum. It was about limits, the limits of authority, and the boundaries drawn by the Constitution. Several attorneys in the room began flipping through their legal pads and annotated casebooks. Pages turned quickly. Quiet whispers spread between colleagues. Is there precedent for this? Could this be appealed? What standard applies here? Even the court clerk, who had been typing steadily just moments before, slowed down, glancing up at the bench with uncertainty. Pam Bondi had not raised her voice once. She hadn't accused the judge of overreach. She hadn't questioned his character or his motives. She had simply reframed the situation. "This is not about religion in the courtroom," she concluded, her tone steady and composed. "It is about whether the government can fine someone for quietly expressing their faith." There it was. Clear, direct, unavoidable. The room was silent. Not the earlier silence of shock or confusion, but the silence of realization. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked. Only minutes earlier, he had seemed completely certain. His gavel had come down decisively. His tone had been firm, unquestioned. Now, his confidence appeared tempered. He wasn't cornered by defiance. He was cornered by logic. If he upheld the fine, he risked appearing to punish peaceful expression. If he reversed it, he risked seeming inconsistent. Either way, the decision now carried far more weight than he had initially anticipated. The gallery waited. Reporters held their breath, pens hovering over paper. No one wanted to miss a single word. The judge exhaled slowly. "This court," he began carefully, "has a responsibility to ensure fairness and avoid any perception of bias." He paused. "But it also has a responsibility to uphold constitutional protections." The shift in tone was unmistakable. He glanced briefly toward Pam Bondi, then back across the courtroom. "The fine is under reconsideration." A wave of surprise swept across the gallery. Not loud, not chaotic, but powerful. Eyebrows lifted, shoulders relaxed. A few people exchanged wide-eyed looks. The gavel did not strike this time. Instead, the judge continued. "This court will take a brief recess to review the matter more thoroughly." With that, he stood and exited through the chamber door behind the bench. And just like that, the authority that had felt absolute minutes earlier now felt measured. As the room slowly filled with hushed conversation, one thing was clear. This was no longer about a necklace. It was about principle. And for the first time since the confrontation began, it seemed that principle might prevail. After a brief recess, the courtroom doors opened once again. Conversations stopped instantly. The judge walked back to the bench, his expression composed but noticeably more measured than before. The earlier tension had not disappeared. It had transformed. Now it carried anticipation. Everyone rose as he took his seat. Papers were adjusted, pens were lifted, the silence returned. Upon further review, he began carefully, glancing down at a sheet of notes before looking up again. The court withdraws the fine. The necklace may remain. For a split second, no one reacted. Then the meaning settled in. The fine, gone. The order, reversed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sweeping speech, no apology, no acknowledgement of error. The judge simply moved forward, signaling that proceedings would continue. But the message was unmistakable. Pam Bondi had won. Not through confrontation, not through outrage, but through clarity. She didn't smile broadly. She didn't celebrate. She gave a small, respectful nod and returned to her notes as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. And that quiet response made the moment even more powerful. Because this had never been about public attention. It had been about principle. When court adjourned later that day, the energy outside the courthouse felt completely different from the tense atmosphere that had filled it that morning. Reporters rushed forward the moment she stepped through the doors. Microphones extended, cameras flashed. Voices called her name from every direction. Ms. Bondi, do you feel your rights were violated? Was this religious discrimination? Do you plan further action? They expected outrage. They expected a fiery statement, a sharp rebuke, a dramatic condemnation of judicial overreach. Instead, she gave them something far more controlled. This was never about a necklace, she said calmly, her tone steady despite the noise around her. It was about principle. In this country, we protect both freedom from religion and freedom of religion. That balance matters. The statement was simple, but it carried weight. She didn't attack the judge. She didn't accuse the court of bias. She didn't frame herself as a victim. She framed the issue as a reminder that constitutional protections are not theoretical. They are practical. They exist in everyday moments, sometimes even in something as small as a piece of jewelry. The story spread quickly. By evening, headlines were circulating across news platforms and social media. Commentators debated the legal nuances. Some praised her composure. Others discussed the broader implications for courtroom neutrality and individual rights. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. Her response had been masterful. What made it so powerful wasn't just the legal argument, it was her restraint. In a moment when many would have reacted emotionally, raising their voice, making bold accusations, turning the situation into a spectacle, she chose calm logic. She chose measured reasoning. She chose confidence. And that choice changed everything. Inside that courtroom, she had demonstrated something rarely seen in high-pressure public moments. Control. Control of tone. Control of emotion. Control of narrative. She didn't allow the situation to escalate into a clash of personalities. Instead, she elevated it into a discussion of constitutional boundaries. She used the law itself as her shield. She turned a fine into a constitutional lesson. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded everyone watching, whether in that courtroom or later through the news, that confidence doesn't require shouting. Strength does not require anger. Authority does not require volume. Sometimes, the strongest move you can make is simply asking the right question, and then standing calmly while the answer reveals itself. In the days that followed, legal analysts would replay the moment again and again. The phrasing, the tone, the precision of her argument. But those who were physically present in the room remembered something even more striking. The stillness. The moment when logic replaced tension. The instant when certainty gave way to reconsideration. The image of her standing there, calm and unwavering, became symbolic. Not just of faith, not just of legal knowledge, but of courage under pressure. Because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, measured, unshaken. And as the courthouse doors closed behind her that day, one thing was certain. The judge may have intended to enforce authority. Instead, she reinforced a principle. And in doing so, she made a statement that no one in that room would ever forget. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, real-life moments that prove calm confidence can change everything.